Hi, I want to welcome everyone to today's event, conversation with the fantastic filmmaker Eliza Hittman. Today's event is part of the film series that we've been running all year called Rewind, the Shenshin Retrospective Film Series. This year's theme for the series has been Jewish American women filmmakers, and we say from Girlfriends to Clueless because I think that's the last film in the program, but really I think maybe even chronologically started before Girlfriends, so it's kind of a misnomer. If you've been to previous events, you know that my colleague Shana Hammerman usually does the introductions, but today we decided to mix things up a little bit, so I'll be handling the introductions and welcoming everyone on behalf of the Toby Center. Our guest of honor today, obviously, is Eliza Hittman. Eliza is a screenwriter and director who has made 3 critically acclaimed feature films over the past 10 years. It Felt Like Love from 2013 was a New York Times and Village Voice critics pick, in addition to winning various directors' awards. Her second film, which we'll discuss at length today, is Beach Rats from 2017. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where she was awarded the directing awards, and members of the cast were nominated and won acting awards. Following Beach Rats, Hittman was awarded the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship for Filmmaking. She went on to create the acclaimed Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which came out last year, winning awards at Sundance, among a variety of other independent film awards. We began this series celebrating Jewish women filmmakers with one of Eliza's mentors, Claudia Weil, and we are thrilled to celebrate Eliza's work as part of a new generation of path-breaking filmmakers. Richard Meyer is the Robert and Ruth Halperin Professor in Art History. He teaches courses in 20th century American art, the history of photography, art, censorship, and the First Amendment, and gender and sexuality studies. His many publications offer a unique lens into queer imagery and contemporary art, including specific work on queer Jewish art. His most recent book, What Was Contemporary Art?, questions the radical newness around ideas of the contemporary. And Richard this year is the interim head of the program in feminist gender and sexuality studies. And as you can see, they are having an anniversary party, May 22nd from 1 to 4. Please RSVP at the email address included below. Shana Hammerman, who will be asking questions later, is the Associate Director of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies. And I am Eitan Kensky, the Reinhardt Family Curator of Judaica and Hebraica collections. And I feel like I've been talking for quite a long time now. So Shana, I understand why you didn't want to do this. Why don't we get started? First, Eliza, again, thank you. It's such an honor to have you here today to talk with us. You know, it's really exciting. And I think I wanted to ask you just a kind of very basic question, which is, where did Beach Rats come from? You know, how did you come up with this idea and develop this story? And maybe we could even start with just kind of the most very obvious question. What drew you to telling the story of a young man struggling with his sexuality?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I'm happy to be here and to connect with all of you. And thank you, everybody who's out there watching. It's interesting to go back and revisit Beach Rats because obviously I've spent the last year or so promoting a different film, Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always. So I apologize. It might take me a minute because I have to sort of reach back inside my brain to think back at, all the moments in which, your questions for today that we're going to be discussing. I made a film called It Felt Like Love that was a coming of age narrative that explored this sort of unsentimental coming of age story in Brooklyn. And it was, I think, through a very unique female gaze. And I had a curiosity in, what would it be like for me to inhabit a male point of view as a female filmmaker? And to tell almost a parallel companion piece to It Felt Like Love that explores like a male journey, a male coming of age story, and I guess the way that I define a coming of age story is not this narrative of transformation. It's in a way this sort of process of disillusionment, learning about who you are in relationship to the world at a very vulnerable, critical moment of adolescence or, of teenager years, or these moments that define you, that wound you, that scar you, that you kind of carry with you for the rest of your life. Beach Rats, it's not it's not anything autobiographical, obviously, but the themes that, you know, inhabit this family story are themes that have inhabited my family. You know, the themes around internalized homophobia, the, you know, themes around repression, and living in this sort of liminal space of being sort of half in and, you know, half out of the closet. But you know, I think that there's, you know, a delicate line in being a filmmaker, and I want to draw from my experiences, but not write about them autobiographically. And they're themes and issues that affected me in my youth quite directly, you know, but I think, you know, my own family would be too vulnerable for me to speak about it on those terms, you know, more directly related to my family, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
Yeah, but they were always things that interested me, and there was always yeah, you know, there are always things that I knew I wanted to explore in film at some point in my life. And it felt like an exciting challenge to do it within a male story.
I did wanted to ask about the question of whether or not there was any kind of intentional dislocation, whether or not there was something very personal that was trying to work its way out by looking at something that was maybe perhaps parallel. So rather than a Jewish family, looking at an Italian family, or rather than one part of Brooklyn, moving it to another part of Brooklyn and changing some other particulars in order to make it into a new story while reflecting something personal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not such a far dislocation. You know, we're talking a few subway stops, you know, out. It's, you know, one or two stops from where I grew up, you know, in a sense.
Yeah, I'd also wanted to ask you about the coming of age genre. You kind of, you've got it right away. It seems like your movies kind of take place. I liked what you said about these wounds that develop and kind of will affect them the rest of their lives, but they all really seem to hinge on a particular moment of crisis. That there is something that is happening that is exposing these wounds and making it up and making it something that needs to be confronted. And maybe it also has to do with the kind of narrative gap or emotional gap between how someone sees themselves and how the world perceives them.
Yeah, I think, you know, that is my goal in these stories. And I think that I think of them, you know, not explicitly as films that appeal to youth, but I think that people find a connection to them because they're speaking to universal themes of, you know, alienation and loneliness, and just in a general sense, like the pain of being alive. You know, they have an atmosphere of loneliness and isolation. And I think you could watch them as an audience and say, I remember feeling that, or you could watch them as an adult and still connect to those emotions, which I think resonate from the work. But yeah, and there, you know, I think when I started making films, I had this desire to make films for young people, that I wanted to make smart, artful narratives, you know, that don't condescend to a young audience. And I ended up in this weird zone of making films about youth, you know, that don't quite cross over into a youth space. You know, they're sort of dangerous movies for youth to watch, which I like too. But I think, you know, I think for me, it's important that there are narratives that capture the sort of everyday experience of growing up, you know.
It kind of feels like you're finding the horror of everyday life and the horror of these kind of particular moments in time.
Yeah, and they're small moments, but they're, you know, massively transformative in some ways. And I think I lost my train of thought, but yeah, I think for me it's important, you know, that we see that boredom, that malaise of kind of growing up on screen, because that's part of the experience. And I think sometimes, cinema, it veers towards a more idealistic representation of coming of age, or on the other side, like really nihilistic. And my films are just all in this very in-between place, of existence, which can feel long when you're young.
I think Richard wants to ask a question.
I was just going to follow up on that. I noticed that I believe almost the exact same sentence Frankie says in two different parts of the movie in response to someone asking him what he's into. And he says, I really don't know what I like. And that seemed to me to be true of this character, that he wasn't sure, not just sexually, but he wasn't really sure where he was going to fit in terms of the neighborhood, the family, the male power or friendship network, the girl. I'm forgetting the character who was the girlfriend. I'm sorry. She's very Simone. Yeah. And the reason I ask this is because most of the other characters in the movie, I wouldn't say that was their answer. People seem to know what they want. Simone seems pretty good at, I think, at making clear what she wants. I mean, he's not able to provide it. That's where problems happen in their relationship. But I think that one thing for me as a man of a certain age who identifies as, who's a gay man, it was clear that he, Frankie, as a physical presence, but also as a tortured, secretive, but sexualized subject, was, I wanted him. I don't mean literally, I wanted him as an object, but I wanted to understand and help and follow his character. So to make this into a question, is that how you thought dramatically, or as the writer or the director? He's not going to know what he wants, and that's going to be our job as the audience, or we're going to watch his journey in trying to figure out what he wants.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a valid read, of that opening line of the film. For me, like the first thing that a character says in a film is always really important to setting up, in the first line of dialogue that's spoken in general, to sort of setting up the larger themes of the entire film, the larger conflict. And he's a character that has no role models in any sense for helping him articulate, what he's going through. So it's, for me, it was always a little bit as his way around admitting what he liked and what he wanted. He just didn't quite have that ability, and he was stuck. And that, that experience of leading this double life it was about giving the audience access to his experiences, to know that he's, sort of wrestling with himself. But, he's ambivalent to admit to himself, to anybody else, who he is.
It felt, though, at times that the film was trying to see if it could open up a space where there was this kind of divorce between identity and a particular label. And, perhaps for him, it would be accepting the label as being gay, and sexual desire and sexual practice. Mm-hmm. But there's that kind of key scene with Simone where they're talking about whether or not, two men can kiss. And she says that, if two women kiss, that's hot. If two men kiss, that's gay. Mm-hmm. And that this being a moment where he's kind of hoping to play with the boundaries and hoping to maybe kind of find a grounds to stay with her, mm-hmm. and to have whatever, mm-hmm. trappings that would be. But she dismisses that. Mm-hmm. And I think to go off of what Richard was saying and to add into it, it's just that this kind of label hangs over him. And if there was a way to remove the label and the desire.
The label is negative based on where he lives, for sure. Yeah. And seeing her as, somebody who's forming this sort of connection with, or this desire to form this connection with, he was testing her, And it is so much about a film that, this character kind of testing people to see what they will think of who he might want to be someday. And unfortunately, the perspective that he's surrounded by is limited.
Maybe I can back up and ask a kind of more, just kind of filmmaking question of how did you find this cast? How did you put it together? It seems very notable that you like to work with younger actors. What draws you to working with younger actors in your projects? I mean, other than wanting to tell stories about this particular slice of life, it also seems that you enjoy working with less experienced actors.
Mm-hmm. In reality, I've made 3 movies and I feel privileged to have done it. They're also very small films. They are, the first film I made was for under $100,000, and the only way I could do it was by, going to my high school, Edward R. Murrow in Brooklyn, and putting up like casting notices and just doing it all myself. Like there wasn't access to a pool of actors necessarily. But I made short films and I was comfortable working within limitations and pulling performances out of people who had never acted before, because that was the scope of what I was working in. And it's, in a way, it became the process. It wasn't intentional in the beginning. It was just what I had. But when I got to Beach Rats, I don't know if I would do this differently. It was the first time I had like a casting director who was being paid, still a very small movie. And I had always had in the script that he was naked. And it was something that was important to me for the project. And it limited the list significantly of who would consider doing the film. And for me, it was an interesting experiment because I don't think the same thing would have been true at that time if it had been about a woman. There's an expectation that women take off their clothes on screen in a way that it's still very, very taboo in this country to show male nudity. And I refused I said, let's just see who comes in. I'm not gonna make this concession right away. Let's see who is on board. I pursued like non-traditional casting for the film. I had a handful of students who were awesome, who went out to the boardwalk, and I'd give them like different handball courts to go into and meet people. And that worked really well on that film for bringing in possibilities. And but I knew pretty early on that whoever played the lead had to be somebody with a desire to be an actor. I think, when you're casting in a non-traditional sense, for me, like a little bit, the line of exploitation is, do they want to perform in some way? If they do, then I can push them into the acting space. If they don't, it feels, like it's something else. Sorry for the ambulance. So the
No,
lead,
it's great. I felt like it was outside my window. It was very
sorry.
very evocative.
So we ended up getting a casting tape from somebody none of us knew, this actor named Harris Dickinson. And initially we were looking for people from New York who felt like they were from New York, who, were authentically New York. And then I said, well, who's this kid? And he did the audition, and it was a really a really strong and compelling audition. Nobody had ever heard of him before. And then we realized he was tricking us and he was actually British. And my casting director was like, well, you don't want him because he's British. It like bumps up against everything we talked about in our early casting meetings. And I said, well, maybe I was wrong, and I think I learned a lesson, that authenticity isn't necessarily about place, that the authenticity that I'm searching for is actually an emotional authenticity. And I cast him. He had done almost nothing, and it launched his career into these incredible places. And he was fearless. And he said, I have no issues, with the nudity. And his agents, were like, no, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that with your career. There's going to be images of your penis all over the internet. And he was like, I don't care. And there was just a real braveness to what he brought to the role and he never, in the audition, like what was so striking about him was that he didn't like perform anything that was macho. He was just himself. And there were a lot of like auditions of people who were trying to like play tough and like toughen themselves up. And Harris, was just himself. And I believed that he was suffering on some level. And there was truth to, his unhappiness. And that ended up being, the reason that we cast him, and I saw a leading man in him. But I don't have a criteria, is what I'm actually saying. It doesn't have to be a first-time actor. It doesn't have to be a non-actor. For me, it's about casting the widest net that's possible and finding the most emotionally authentic performance, in the mix.
Yeah, it just feels that casting has this kind of thematic resonance with what you were talking about before, of kind of wanting to explore these particular moods and moments of crisis, and that having non-traditional actors in this role could lend itself to that additional authenticity. Richard, it looked like you wanted to jump in there with a question.
Yeah, I know we want to get to the other people's questions soon, but I was really interested in the issue around the ways in which the camera treats Frankie. I think the very first scene, both of the scenes, maybe when he's in front of the computer. Is it Brooklyn Boys, or I can't remember the name of it. It's kind of dark. He has his hat off, and the person says, "Can I can't see you well," and so he sort of he's exposed to the light a little more. Almost immediately, you can see that he's a very handsome young man. And my question is around, as you said, there is a young woman in Hollywood would be expected very quickly, probably, even though I know there are intimacy sorry, I don't know the right word. People on set in a bigger film, right?
Coordinators, sort of, consultants, something.
Right. But if we just look at still Hollywood and the history of Hollywood, women, it's just like this has been part of the job. You look sexy, you might have to show part of. But with men, there's a whole other degree level, as you've talked about, a stigma that can come with it. And I am really interested in whether you were feeling that, okay, I'm not going, because for example, his girlfriend is not you don't really, so far as I remember, the camera doesn't linger on, let's say, her taking off her bra or her being naked in the same way that, and I think it's because we're looking through the eyes of characters, some of the gay men, sometimes hers, maybe sometimes just the world, but what can be acknowledged and what can't be acknowledged about a desirable man of that age and that in that social world. But I wondered, so my question is, was this understood as a queer film? because it was in part about the eroticization of a young, let's just say hot man, very conventionally attractive man whose body you get to see, and not just that the film is desiring him, but it's about him navigating. It's a kind of Bildungsroman, him navigating the wilds of, or sorry, the waves of something of desire, the turbulence of desire, both male and female for him. So did you think about like, okay, if there's going to be looked atness, as Laura Mulvey says, then it's going to be the male body that's going to be looked at, not the female body? Or was it not that overt in your mind?
I don't think that for me personally, I don't think that there is an objective, omniscient point of view that exists in cinema. You are always looking through the filmmaker's eyes. And sometimes within that, you are looking through the character's eyes. So for me, yeah, the moments that you talk about, there are a few moments of like Simone's behind when they first meet her on the boardwalk, but it's through the eyes of the boys checking her out. I am conscious of those decisions. Is it subjective? Who are we seeing her body through? But yeah, in the sex scene between the two of them, it's about his pain. It's not about the, erotic gaze on her body. And that is part of the conversation that I had with the cinematographer. And that is me respecting her body and knowing what the scene is about. It's not unnecessary. She is taking off her shirt, that she does have her bra off, but it's not, it's not meant to arouse a male audience in any way. And I'm aware of what I'm doing with the camera. There are filmmakers who are not aware of what they're doing with the camera when they think they're being objective.
And so who are you imagining would be seeing this?
But
were you
what
imagining it all?
But that's but what I'll say is for me, one of the visual references of the film, I'm not sure if you know this photographer, and if you don't, you should buy his book. Okay, he was a male physique photographer in the 50s, and his name is Danny Fitzgerald, and the book is called Brooklyn Boys. And he was somebody who took like magazine photos of men, and in his spare time he invited all these Brooklyn gang members from Carroll Gardens into his photo studio, and he was photographing Brooklyn gang members. And I thought that was sort of fascinating, that these men who, we associate in one way could have this kind of classical beauty, that he saw this classical beauty in them. These working class kind of, gang members from Red Hook, from all these places. And they're really, for me, it was an exciting discovery of somebody whose work I didn't know. But for me, I don't feel that I was just making an erotic portrait of Harris's body. And there's a tension throughout the film, between this sort of hyper-masculine energy and this classical beauty, and what could happen in the end. I don't think the film, I have to be honest and say that I haven't done an extensive amount of Q&As for the movie because I was assaulted with so much misogyny over making it. because it didn't satisfy people's expectations for what an LGBTQ film should be. It wasn't a coming out story. He never comes out. It's a digging yourself deeper story. And people had a hard time with that, and they had a hard time with the fact that I would make it, and they felt provoked and triggered, and the Q&A was always an assault. I barely got to open my mouth, in a Q&A before I was sort of assaulted with a certain kind of misogynistic energy. And nobody trusts your intentions. So yeah, I don't know, I didn't make the movie trying to, sort of fit into a canon, or, I don't really make movies that are overtly like feel good or feel bad. They're about our experiences and the complexity and sort of everyday pain of navigating these issues, which I think are real. I don't know if that answers your question.
I just want to say, because of what you just said, first of all, I'm so sorry, really, really sorry to hear that. And I'm kind of flabbergasted that would be anybody's response, and anyone who was looking for LGBTQ representation or thinking on feminist terms. To me, it seems like this movie has so much to offer. Yes, maybe it's not in a conventional, tying the narrative up in a sort of, okay, now we're out and we're, queer and we're proud or whatever. Not that that's what people are looking for necessarily, but, I think it's quite unfortunate when art that is layered and that doesn't resolve the issues that we are all living through, but actually confronts us with them, that the art then somehow gets blamed for the difficulty of the issues. And I just would never have thought this movie.
Yeah, I think it's painful. I think that there are people who never get to complete that journey.
Right. Right, and those people, maybe we need to think about, have movies about them too, right? Which is part of what this is. I wasn't sure that he was ever going to complete this journey. That is your Frankie. I wrote in one of my questions, and then I know we're going to move. I'm going to stop asking questions, but like, is he on his way to becoming an out gay man? Is he on his way to becoming a predator, like the friends on, who's going to beat up gay men for drug or others for drugs, or is he in some other area that we don't know where? And I guess that's now that I've talked to you more and thought about it more. Well, I should ask you, but you would. Yeah. I'm predicting you would say there is no one of the right answer to that question.
Yeah, I think that all my films exist in sort of gray zones.
Is that because you're particularly attracted to kind of the narrative ambiguity or the character ambiguity, or just that seems more emblematic of what a coming of age story should be, that it kind of ends with that disillusionment and these moments of rupture without any clear resolution?
Yeah, I think it's more true to sort of everyday life, in my opinion. And it's I think it's the narrative. It's similar for me. And never rarely, this young person takes this journey to New York City, and she does something that transforms her life, but she'll never speak about it, because we don't live in a world still, where you can talk about how important the abortion you had was openly. Her story goes back to normal when the film ends, but in a small way, it was the scariest, darkest trip she's ever taken. And she reclaimed her youth now, but who knows what she's going back to. Nothing I made has had sort of this easy closure. Our stories in life go on and on and on and on.
You opened, and in response to your first question, you brought up this issue of gays, and you've mentioned that a couple of times as something that you were setting out to you intentionally thinking about when you made Beach Rats and how we look at bodies on film and what the camera shows us as being attractive. It also seemed very notable that the characters in this movie are consciously trying to objectify themselves. And as Richard mentioned, there's the Brooklyn Boys website. There's the there's the scene where Simone and Frankie are practicing selfies in order to kind of decide how to posture themselves. When did you start to think about how you wanted about including that in the movie and commenting on this kind of self-objectification that we're all going through?
Yeah, I'm interested in self-objectification and how we frame ourselves like online. And I'm a bit of like, at that time anyway, a bit of like a Facebook stalker. And I went when I made It Felt Like Love, I met all these kids from these younger generation of kids from Sheepshead Bay and Garrettson Beach, and we were friends online on Facebook. So I just kept doing screen grabs of all the images that they would make of themselves. And a lot of the framing and sort of ideas that I was playing with in the film, came from that generation of kids from those neighborhoods and how they were representing themselves. It's a layer of the film. How does he present himself, on this one site that he's using at night, and how does he present himself, in this other zone, maybe, with a girl, wearing his hat in his bedroom. But the opening images of the film came from an image that I found on Facebook of a kid who was in a basement, and he was wearing a hat, and his face was in shadow, and his pants were drooped really low as if he was about to like take them off completely, and you could tell he was like living in this basement cave. And that became the generative image for the film for me. I was like, that is him. And it had this tension that I was talking about between, he thought he was taking a picture that was hyper masculine, but actually it was quite homoerotic, to, another perspective. And that was always, sort of what I was playing with within the film. And I used a lot of appropriated images from Facebook as references. And if you looked at them, you would see the movie is sort of, coming from their ideas on how they see themselves.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your research project. I mean, your research process for this film and how it kind of came together. It really seems very ethnographic, if that's a fair term, to use. So now I'm hearing, it's ethnographic in terms of how people set themselves up online and watching that, but also just the specificity of place and kind of the desire to go into the neighborhood and think, okay, well, who is this person who plays handball here? And how does this person play handball specifically with their friends? So curious if you could say a little bit more of how you approached that, how you approached the research into telling, this particular story. Because as you say, it is this question that loomed over it of why are you telling this story?
I like, I can say like my father is an anthropologist, and he taught at Long Island University, which is in Brooklyn. And I grew up doing field work with him and watching him document a language and travel to a reservation in Nevada and do interviews and collect stories. And it was, a huge part of my childhood. And there's something about that process that's exciting to me. And I don't feel like a traditional writer. I don't have the inspiration and imagination to just sit at a computer. And I am most inspired when I'm out in the world. So I spent a lot of time, in handball courts. And I grew up playing handball. And in a way, it was a poor man's sport, because all you do is have to go down to deli and the bodega and buy a ball for like 50 cents. And that was interesting to me. Like, why haven't I seen that culture on film before? And that's always the question, is like, what does this blue ball mean? Why haven't I seen it in film before? And why was it such a part of, my experience growing up? And then the locations are, true to life in a way. The cruising beach is a real cruising beach. And a spot along the coast of Brooklyn that not that many people know about or have bothered to pull over and explore. But that was interesting to me, to like sit in this dark parking lot and watch people pull in and out and disappear into the darkness, get out of their cars, meet a man, disappear into the darkness. And that's how I saw Frankie, as this young kid who was sort of disappearing into that dark space. It's not a way, to come of age, but other locations are, were fun places that I thought said something about the neighborhood. Like the vape shop is a real vape shop on Sheepshead Bay Road. I'm trying to remember at this point what the other kind of locations are. The fireworks show happens every Friday night on Coney Island. It's part of my experience growing up, which I sort of fold in and like to revisit and think about representing on screen.
Do you think that there's a class level and a class reason for why a lot of these spaces haven't really been explored cinematically in that same way? And then also connected to that, what is maybe you could talk about the class dynamic in Frankie's story and how his particular niche really, impacts what it would mean to adopt this label of gay. Mm-hmm. That it seems like the older men that he pursues or allows himself to be pursued by are also of a higher socioeconomic class. They have this ability to take him to hotels or pick him up in the car. They drive and can talk about the traffic on the BQE, whereas he has to always, take the subway places.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about the class aspect of the films. I think I grew up in New York where a middle class looked very different than our understanding of what a middle class is now. Most of my friends who lived in like Sheepshead Bay and in those neighborhoods, their parents were teachers, their parents were, worked in the Diamond District, and it's not the way, it's a different version of a middle class life that exists in Park Slope, but I think that, people from Park Slope would immediately look at these other neighborhoods and just write them off as blue collar, but they're actually not. There's a gradation to class in those areas, like there is everywhere. And so I always thought of Frankie as being a little bit above those guys. Actually, people were like, oh, he's working class. I was like, actually, the house is a 3-story house. It's a nice house. Like, I would live in that house. It's not like there are characters sort of roaming in and out of frame with hard hats on, but that was an assumption that audiences made. But I thought that his family was quite a nice family, and that his mother, was actually a struggling mother because of the circumstances of the death, but there was no indication of financial struggle, actually. It's about the audience's perception of that world.
Right.
And I think for me, in my mind, he was always slumming it a little bit with his friends, and that was the mother's issue.
Yeah, you can. I think that is palpable. How much she thinks that these people are beneath him, And it kind of goes with this sense of how inexplicable, right, it is to her that he would be with these people. So I want to encourage people to start leaving questions in the Q&A, in the chat, in the Q&A, in case I actually can't see them, so maybe they're there already. But Richard, why don't we ask I know you want to ask another question in the meantime.
Well, there is a question in the Q&A. So why don't we go to that, and then I'll ask my question after.
Great.
Do you want me to read it out loud? Can you guys not see it?
I can see it. I'll look at it again. Hold on.
Yeah, I can jump in and do this so you don't have to be looking at your computers.
Oh.
So one of our attendees asks, I really enjoyed how the film portrays nighttime. Can you talk about nighttime as a theme and the challenges of filming in the dark? I think we can also maybe extend that to the basement, right, which is a dark place as well. And you'd mentioned how you saw this kid kind of growing into the darkness instead of into the light, maybe.
Yeah, it's a challenge to light a beach at night, especially when you're a low budget production. And like I said, I enjoy those challenges. One of the films that I looked at as kind of just a lighting reference, shoot, am I going to remember it? There's a few films by a filmmaker named Philippe Grandrieux. I don't know if I'm butchering his name. He makes very minimal narratives and has like very aggressive handheld lighting. And I looked at his films, and then another photographer, another reference that I looked at was, I'm going to have this. Give me one second. My memory these days is atrocious. Barbara Crane. She's a photographer who took photos in like the 80s. And she took photos of people, like bodies interacting at big kind of like fairs in the summertime, or like, big public spaces in the summertime at night. And they're like really intimate photos that are captured of, like someone putting their hand in their girlfriend's pocket, like these little moments of sort of physical interaction between bodies amidst this sort of hot summer. And because they're Polaroids, because she was shooting Polaroids, there was this frontal flash that you can feel the presence of. She wasn't ever hiding the presence of the frontal light. And I liked that idea, and like looking at these films by Philippe Grandrieux and these photos, these Polaroid photography, photos from Barbara Crane. And Barbara Crane, I also say she's short like me. So the perspective, is quite restricted. And what you're seeing, comes from this small woman's body. So I took this idea of a frontal light and not hiding the fact that we're lighting, and used it on the beach, almost like a flashlight. Like I am, as the filmmaker, shining a flashlight on what is happening, in the darkness between Frankie and these men. And I embraced it as a style, like handheld lighting on the beach at night. We never put anything down on the sand. And it was interesting. Like when I told my producers that this is how we were going to light at night, they all start throwing suggestions at me, like, "Oh, what if you put something there? We could do like cell phones." Everybody was worried. Nobody wants you to shoot film in the darkness. Everybody starts worrying that it's not going to expose. You're not going to see things. It's not enough light. It's their job to sort of worry about, those things. And I think, for me, I feel like, I could have made a moonlight You know, I could have pushed light from the highway. I could have had a boat pushing light from the water. Those are all the conventional things, but like, why do that in cinema? You know, we don't have to, you know, even though I'm making a film that's like realistic, you know, I don't have to be realistic in these choices that I make in terms of, you know, how to light the frame, if that makes sense. So it's non-realistic lighting, you know, non-realistic lighting, you know,
I mean,
throughout.
it's non-realistic lighting that adds to the level of realism because you feel as if you're intruding on actual people who are there.
Yeah, and that was the idea, you know, is like I am giving you, you know, this access to this moment that you wouldn't ordinarily see.
Well, that's sort of
Richard, go ahead.
There's another question. I don't know why they're in two different places. This one's in the chat. Should I just read it?
Sure. I'll read it. This person wants to ask about something you said at the beginning about portraying a male character from a female gaze. What do you think that your female gaze bring male characters and to gay culture in general? Did you have a particular in mind that you wanted to communicate about this character from your own female perspective that is somehow to a male gaze?
I mean, I feel like we sort of covered this question came in quite early in the chat, and I think we sort of covered it. You know, I don't know. I feel like, you know, the film communicates what I wanted to bring to I don't know. I think the film communicates my perspective, if that makes sense. I don't know. I feel like we kind of covered
yeah,
this.
I do. I think it does do that. And I think also one of the kind of astonishing things is that these are really vulnerable characters, all of them. And even though you are not yourself a gay man, I never felt like you were judging the characters. So you have this very non-judgmental way of just kind of letting them exist in the world and make mistakes and sometimes do dangerous things without sort of condemning them.
I think that, you know, what does the film say to sort of gay culture in general? You know, if you want an in general summation of what the film says, for me, it says, you know, internalized homophobia is dangerous. You know, it's dangerous for a human being, and it's dangerous for a community, and it's dangerous for a culture, you know, and we've seen that in places. We've saw that at Pulse nightclub. You know, I don't think the film is so message driven, but I think if you don't walk away feeling like, you know, that what he feels about himself ends up, you know, having an impact on another person's life, you know, I don't know. It doesn't, you know, it's not so overtly message driven, but I do think that message, you know, comes from the film.
I think that's really important. And one of the things makes it a challenge for me as someone who teaches about censorship and sexually explicit materials and things that literally are meant to be triggering. I mean, they caused like, you know, laws to be rewritten and trials to happen, and objects were defaced and destroyed because they were confronting limits. And I think that sometimes, like sorry, let me try to phrase this properly. One of the things I appreciated about your film from the very first scene, I'm like, okay, I'm watching this young man who's on this, what I would call an app, but who's online with these other gay guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. You're just breaking up for a second.
Oh shit, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'll just get to the point then. What I think is so valuable is for us to realize that art, whether it's film, painting, a book, it doesn't just speak from an identity-based perspective. That the way desire circulates, the way desire is represented, that, like, for example, in this instance, obviously Frankie's issues around not being able to fully acknowledge his whatever we want to call it, attraction to other men has all sorts of implications for his would-be girlfriend, his family, his friends. These are circuits that we're all implicated in or touched by, regardless of what our specific degree of, identification or disidentification is. And to me, what I love about a movie like this is that it gets my students. I don't ask my students, well, what do you queer students think? What do you as with female identified students? I want to know, what do they think about desire and secrecy? What do they think about Avenue? Is it Avenue Y? Because I went to high school on Avenue Z. Was it Avenue Y or was it, anyway, I don't know. What do they think about, like Coney Island as opposed to Upper East Side of Manhattan? Mm-hmm. I feel like those are the issues as a human story that the film brings up. So I just feel I know I'm giving a little oratory here or whatever, but I just feel sad that, but it's understandable to me that people would get angry at you, Eliza, because I think that there's already a right answer that people have in their minds now about how you deal with certain questions around identity, difference, desire. And if your film or your book or your scholarship or class is not delivering the right answer very clearly from the get-go, then that can be a problem. Mm-hmm. And I wish, I don't know if that's how any of you experience it, but that's how I experience it sometimes.
Yeah, I think, I occupy a very small space in the filmmaking industry for women, and men have been inhabiting female spaces and owning those stories forever, for as long as the film industry has existed. So, I don't know, it was hard as a filmmaker to sort of be shamed for making a film, that was not this, people liked the movie until it didn't go the way that they wanted it to go, essentially. And then I was a bad filmmaker, in their mind. They're like, then it became exploitative when the movie didn't go the way that they wanted it to go. And in reality, I think the film is upsetting to people, which I respect, but in reality, there's just one punch in the movie. What we do to female bodies historically on screen, is much more graphic in terms of nudity and in terms of violence. There's one punch in the movie. And the ambiguity of what happens, of course, people are supposed to worry about that kid who shows up, of course they are, and feel for him. But I don't think that the film is explicit in terms of violence in any way, compared to, what we see on screen.
It's not explicit, but there is a kind of an air of foreboding that kind of hovers in this film. And I think that's directly linked to the kind of internal struggle that the character is having. That you expect that violence is going to result in one way or another because of this kind of unreconciled self inside. Yeah,
and I think that, the film, if you wanted to look at it from a message point of view, it has value, that internalized homophobia has destructive consequences. I don't think the film says anything else.
We have time for 2 more questions. Shayna has one she wants to ask, and then I have a kind of meta question about the series.
Yeah, my question also is sort of pulling back away from Beach Rats and just to you as a filmmaker in general. One of the things that you said early on was that you kind of always wanted to make films for young people, and whether or not you're really for young people or just about them, I think that's a kind of question we can ask. But I was wondering if there were particular films that inspired you in this desire to make these young, or if there are particular films that you're against that you feel don't portray these everyday stories, as you called them.
I don't know if things that, it's hard to go into things that I am against necessarily. obviously there's some connections between the types of stories that I make and like Truffaut, like a 400 Blows, or like the first, I'm trying to think of other things. I'm a big fan of like Bresson and the film Mouchette, and looking at, her life. And I was looking at a lot of New York films and thinking, when I made this film, like thinking about films like Saturday Night Fever, like kids who are on the fringes of the city, like in this kind of stagnant communities, and they still exist, but we're not making movies about them anymore. There's a kind of dominant, affluent kind of cinema that comes out of New York. And, I was sort of asking myself the question, like, well, why aren't we still making movies about people who sort of feel really far from Manhattan, and don't fit into Manhattan spaces and New York City in the way that we think of them? I think all of my films are like about characters who are kind of outsiders to New York for different reasons. I don't know if that answers your question, but
that's great.
Yeah.
It does also, and you see that when like Simone expects that on their date they're going to go into the city, that they're about to get on the train to go to Manhattan in order to do something. And it is true also that the plot of Saturday Night Fever is kind of, we want to go to Manhattan and then we don't get to Manhattan, in an odd way. So I did want to ask you before we close the kind of question. This is a series on Jewish American women filmmakers, and I was curious how you felt that identity did or did not impact you as a creative person, as a director, as a filmmaker, and whether or not it's something that you consider. I mentioned earlier that I felt there was some dislocation, but other than that, I'm wondering if you've given this issue much thought before.
Yeah, I think for me as a filmmaker, it's not something like, religion isn't something like I've overtly explored on film and in relationship to, my Jewish identity. Like I was raised a Reform Jew in Brooklyn. My grandparents, were right off, right out of the tenements on the Lower East Side. My dad grew up in a tenement apartment in Manhattan. Everybody was dirt poor. And even though, my family sort of rose over the years to, a middle class, like there's still a fear that the rug could be really pulled out from under you. And I don't think anyone in my family grew up comfortable, even if they became middle class, because of how scary the Lower East Side was and how scary the Great Depression was and all of those things and how that impacted the psychology and sort of trauma of my family. But those, but I didn't grow up necessarily so connected to Jewish faith. And I think that the rift grew and grew and grew generation to generation to generation. But it is, something I would like to get closer to in my filmmaking, and is definitely something that I plan to sort of integrate into the worlds of the films that I build in the future.
Yeah, it seems that the characters feel as if they come from particular places and they come from a particular tradition, and that in their own way they're asking themselves, where do I fit? Where do I fit within that tradition? And I think that's a theme that gets worked out in a lot of Jewish American culture, of exactly how does that weight of family, of inheritance work itself into my own experience of things.
Totally.
So I think on that note, we're going to turn off the recording. Thank you to everyone for coming to today's conversation with Eliza Hittman. We have 2 more events upcoming this quarter as part of this series. Next Thursday at the same time, I believe, we're going to have an event with the critic Adam Naiman about called The Reappraisal, which is about Elaine May's film Ishtar. And Nora Ephron's debut feature, This Is My Life. Adam is the writer of Showgirls, It Doesn't Suck, and we're going to be looking at critical appraisal as a concept, and especially as it works out in the very idiosyncratic vision of Elaine May. And finally, on May 20th, after spending all this time in New York, we're going to have a program called LA Jews, in which we explore the fact that there are, in fact, Jews who live on the West Coast, and some of them even live in Los Angeles. So I hope that you'll be able to join us. I can't remember the time offhand. Shayna, do you remember that?
No, so
we'll send out an
we'll
email
send out
to everyone who
communication,
attends,
yeah.
probably several. So thank you again. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Shayna. Thank you especially to Eliza. This has been a lot of fun.